Hi, I'm Jeanette Roche. This is Forum Daily West. Here are some of the top stories we've been following. Freedom Convoy organizers found guilty of mischief for their roles in the massive 2022 protests in Ottawa. Plus, world markets take a nosedive following President Trump's tariff announcements. And Alberta Premier says despite her initial reaction, she's not actually celebrating tariff exemptions. Thanks so much for joining us. Freedom Convoy organizers Tamara Lich and Chris Barber were handed mixed verdicts Thursday in Ottawa for their roles in the mass protest in the country's capital that lasted over a 3-week period in 2022. Both Lich of Medicine Hat, Alberta, and Barber of Swift Current, Saskatchewan, were found guilty of mischief and counseling mischief. And Barber was convicted of counseling others to disobey a court order about honking truck horns. But both were found not guilty of all other charges, including intimidation, obstructing a police, and counseling others for those offenses. Court has been adjourned to April 16th to set a date for sentencing. The Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, who defended Chris Barber, says they're disappointed with the verdict, referencing that it was originally scheduled for 16 days but consumed massive resources of Crown prosecutors and took up to 45 court days from September of 2023 to September of the following year. Here to comment is Hatem Akir, a lawyer with the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. Mr. Akir, welcome. Thanks for joining us today. Now, I just have to ask, with these mischief charges, what sort of sentencing time could Lich and Barber be facing in terms of minimum and maximum sentencing?
So for mischief, the range is quite large. It ranges on the low end from an absolute discharge, which is essentially no punishment, you're free to go, all the way up to a maximum of 10 years in prison.
Do you know if they plan to appeal the judge's decision?
From what I do know, I believe that Tamara Lich has already announced her intention to appeal, and Chris Barber and his lawyer are currently reviewing the situation, from what I understand.
Okay, now the JCCF has pointed out how much of the time and resources this has taken up in the court system. Now, do you care to comment about that?
What's striking about this whole trial is the application of the prosecution's discretion and how they've managed the whole thing. It's prosecutors have quite a bit of discretion in how they take forward cases, what they put emphasis on. I used to be a Crown myself, and there's an immense pressure to prioritize the most important cases, because the reality is that the court does not have the time to try every single case. If every single case went to trial, the whole system would fall apart. If even 10% of cases went to trial, the system would fall apart. And we've seen in the news how serious charges like sexual assaults and robberies have been stayed because they've taken too long to go to trial. And so it's telling that the Crown has focused in on this act of protest and spent over 40 days of court time trying to bring it to trial. For, at the end of the day, what ended up being charged, findings of guilt for mischief, which is a property offense.
Yeah, you have a good point there. So what do you think that says about the government's motivation in a particular case like this?
Well, it reveals the government's priorities here, not just the priorities between offenses in terms of focusing on this as being so serious as to warrant the resources that it took, but also the priorities between different kinds of protests. The Freedom Convoy is not alone in being a disruptive protest or a protest that took place on a street and obstructed traffic, but it is alone, or at least seems to be pretty unique in terms of the government's approach to criminalizing it and approaching it as a criminal issue, whereas protests for other political issues that are potentially more favorable to the government or politically favorable are treated in a much more lenient fashion.
We appreciate your time today, Hatem. That was Hatem Akir, a lawyer with the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. Well, back on the campaign trail in Quebec today, Liberal leader Mark Carney and NDP's Jagmeet Singh expressed support for federal spending to ensure a strong national public broadcaster, a notion Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre dismissed as something Canada simply cannot afford.
If elected, my government will take action to enshrine and protect and strengthen CBC Radio Canada for generations to come. We will not only increase CBC Radio Canada's funding by $150 million, but we will also make this funding statutory, meaning that Parliament as a whole will need to approve any future changes to its funding, not just the Cabinet.
After U.S. President Donald Trump announced tariffs on imports, Canadian and U.S. stock markets plunged deep in the red for a second day, with the S&P TSX Composite Index down more than 1,000 points. Everything from crude oil to big tech stocks to the value of the U.S. dollar against the loonie and other currencies has fallen. Economists say Trump's tariffs carry the risk of a potentially toxic mix of weakening economic growth and higher inflation. However, U.S. President Donald Trump says his trade policies will never change and that he's simply reciprocating the tariffs that have been placed on the United States by other countries for decades. Alberta's premier says she doesn't want to appear exuberant about dodging the bullet with Donald Trump's latest tariffs on imported vehicles, following Trump's April 2nd announcement on worldwide tariffs on a list of countries which Canada seemed to be exempt from. Danielle Smith released a statement entitled "A Big Win for Alberta and Canada," as she said it appears the United States has decided to uphold the majority of the free trade agreement. She went on to say, "This is precisely what I have been advocating for from the U.S. administration for months." On Thursday, Smith told business leaders in downtown Calgary she didn't want to appear she was celebrating.
Because we have our friends who are heavily invested, obviously, in steel and aluminum and the auto sector who are going to be hurt. We are grateful that the vast, vast majority of the goods in Alberta are now going to be tariff-free. We have about 5,000 jobs impacted by aluminum and steel. And the real problem that we have is that because it's convention to have a measured response, I'm actually hearing more people are impacted by our measured response of import tariffs than they are from the tariffs that have been levied by the U.S. administration. So I would say this is overall a very positive development. We know that there's still sector-specific tariffs that are going to come in around semiconductors, around pharmaceuticals. He continues to target supply management, so there's likely to be something there. We still have a very devastating situation for our forestry sector. So it's it's hard for me to celebrate when I know that there are a number of sectors who are being hurt. But this is good that we are at least going to accelerate the renegotiation of the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. I think I've been asking for that. It sounds like the new Prime Minister has been asking for that as well. And that appears to be where we're going, a renegotiation on that right after this election is over, and that will be very positive.
Although the latest across-the-board reciprocal tariffs will not be imposed on Canada, on Thursday, acting as the Prime Minister, Mark Carney said Canada will hit back against U.S. President Donald Trump's 25% auto tariffs with matching levies on vehicles imported from the United States. All that money, he said, will go directly to auto workers and companies in Canada affected by the expanding trade war.
The President's actions will reverberate here in Canada and across the world. 3 different sets of U.S. tariffs remain in place and will continue to pose significant threats to Canadian workers and Canadian businesses. Just last evening, workers from Unifor Local 444, with whom I met last week, learned that their auto assembly plant in Windsor will be shutting down for at least the next 2 weeks. That's 3,600 workers who are now out of work, not by their choice.
Carney is referring to automaker Stellantis, which is temporarily pausing production at its assembly plant in Windsor, Ontario, for 2 weeks as it assesses the effects of the recently announced U.S. tariffs on imported vehicles. Ontario Premier Doug Ford echoes his concern for the auto sector, but says he was relieved to see Canada is not facing any new reciprocal tariffs.
Hopefully this plant's going to reopen. It's a temporary shutdown. I've mentioned my concerns to the CEO of Stellantis and how we need to have this plant up and going. I think the threat's very high. Even at 12.5%, these auto companies aren't making money hand over fist. They're basically trying to get by day by day and keep their people employed. So our goal is to continue negotiating down to a 0%. I truly believe the president's waiting for this election to be over.
After a call between Mark Carney and the premiers, Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew spoke up, saying his province will support Ontario's auto industry as it's a net benefit for the Canadian economy. But he also shared his concerns for the Chinese tariffs impacting our country's ag sector.
I stressed to the Prime Minister, and he was very receptive to this, that we're still in Manitoba facing a trade war on two fronts. While we're dealing with the Trump administration's tariffs on steel and goods that are not covered by the CUSMA.
The Alberta Serious Incident Response Team is investigating the death of a man after he went into medical distress in police custody. According to Lethbridge Police, officers responded to a report of an unwanted person at a South Side residence on March 24th. A 59-year-old man was arrested after he was acting erratically at the scene and was physically restrained by police. The man was put in a police vehicle but later became unresponsive while officers were still on the scene. EMS transported him to Chinook Regional Hospital, but he died 9 days later on April 2nd. A CERT is currently in Lethbridge and investigating the matter. The Alberta government is accelerating plans for expanding cardiac services in southern Alberta, which includes a new cardiac catheterization lab project to be built in Lethbridge. The province says if Budget 2025 is passed, $5 million will go towards advanced plans for extensive cardiac and intensive care services in Lethbridge and Medicine Hat. However, the funds from this year's proposed budget will be specifically on detailed planning of the proposed Lethbridge lab, with construction funds to be determined in a future budget. Following planning, it is expected that 34 beds will be added to the Chinook Regional Hospital and 8 beds added to the Medicine Hat Hospital. Budget 2025 also includes $22 million towards an interim cardiac catheterization lab at the Red Deer Regional Hospital, which will serve Central Albertans ahead of the hospital's $1.8 billion redevelopment project. United Nurses of Alberta announced Thursday they have overwhelmingly ratified a 4-year collective agreement with Alberta Health Services. The new agreement will mean more than 35,000 UNA members will see a 20% pay increase over the next 4 years, including an immediate pay increase of up to 15%. Over 95% of eligible registered nurses and psychiatric nurses voted in favor of the agreement, in addition to 100% of all UNA's 124 affected locals. President of United Nurses of Alberta, Heather Smith, told BCN that nurses are now feeling hopeful about working in Alberta.
We talked about the 3 R's during this round of negotiations: respect, retention, recruitment. And there's elements in this new deal that I feel touch on all of them. The other important element of this settlement is what I identified as a need from the outset, and that is hope. Going into this round of bargaining, I think nurses have felt disrespected. They did not feel that the contributions they made to this province, to Albertans throughout COVID, had been acknowledged or respected, and they wanted hope in terms of meaningful ways to retain the nurses we have and recruit new into our profession and our workplaces. And I think that's why we saw such an overwhelming acceptance, is that nurses could say, you know, in this settlement, I see elements of respect, I see retention, I see recruitment, and I see hope.
The St. Mary Irrigation District says they have set this year's initial water allocation at 12 inches of water per acre. This means an increase from 8 inches in 2024, which was later increased to 9 inches due to timely rains. The Board of Directors for St. Mary River Irrigation District, George Lohus, says they've managed to accumulate 110,000 acre-feet of storage for the 2025 growing season, and reservoirs levels look better going into the new crop. The City of Lethbridge reports the St. Mary Reservoir current levels at 51%, a large increase from 15% from this time in 2024. The St. Mary River Irrigation District is the largest irrigation district in North America, with over 2,000 kilometers in canals serving over 518,000 acres. Irrigation season is forecasted to kick off in the second week of May, subject to weather conditions. The Canadian economy saw its biggest loss of jobs in more than 3 years last month, and the unemployment rate ticked higher. Statistics Canada says the economy lost 33,000 jobs in March, the biggest drop since January of 2022. The agency says the unemployment rate for March rose to 6.7% compared with 6.6% in February. The drop in jobs reverses some of the gains made by the economy at the end of last year and into January. Some experts say prices of used cars are already on the rise because of the 25% U.S. tariffs on Canadian auto imports announced this week by President Trump. The CEO of used car marketplace AutoZen, Sean McTavish, says some prices are going up as sellers anticipate buyers looking for a better deal compared to a new vehicle. That is your Forum Daily West report. I'm Jeanette Roche. Thanks so much for watching.